Welcome everyone to the Mapping the Digital Gap 2025 Outcomes Report launch. It's my pleasure to welcome you all into this beautiful online space this morning. My name is Naomi Moran. I'm a proud Nyambul and Arakwal woman from the beautiful Bundjalung Nation here on the north coast of New South Wales, and a Dunghutti woman from the mid-north coast of New South Wales. I'd like to honour and certainly acknowledge my bloodlines and cultural responsibilities as an Aboriginal woman with deep pride this morning. I serve as a New South Wales Treaty Commissioner, but also a member, and proudly so, of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group, and formerly the CEO of the Koori Mail newspaper, our national Indigenous newspaper, based here on the beautiful Bundjalung country also. And certainly want to acknowledge that was a role that shaped so much of the way I show up in community, and definitely in this kind of work in support of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group. It's a privilege to be your MC today as we launch the third Mapping the Digital Gap 2025 Outcomes Report. This report brings together the first phase of research captured across remote communities between 2022 and 24, their experiences, their challenges, their strengths, and the digital realities shaping daily life. We'll also get a first look at the new First Nations dashboard, and this work has been made possible through Telstra's funding partnership and delivered by the Australian Digital Inclusion Index team at the Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. I'm joining you today from Bundjalung country here in a little country town called Austinville, but I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country and your countries. I want to honour elders, those who are no longer with us, and those who are present in their wisdom, their care and connection that holds us all steady. I also acknowledge all First Nations people joining us from across the country today, and thank you for bringing your presence and your strength into this space this morning. Outcome 17 of Closing the Gap speaks directly to what we are here to discuss, that our people must have access to information and services that support informed decision-making about our own lives. The target is clear, that equal levels of digital inclusion for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can happen by 2026. We've seen strong engagement from the Australian government and from Ministers Michelle Rowland and Anika Wells in elevating digital inclusion as a national priority. This includes establishing the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group, which, again, I'm very proud to be part of. Last year, we released the First Nations Digital Inclusion Roadmap, which was a significant milestone grounded in community voice and lived experience. Mapping the Digital Gap is a powerful piece of work because it's place-based and community-led. 12 remote and very remote communities partnered in this research, and every bit of data collected is returned to those communities to support their own local strategies, with more than 1,500 remote communities and homelands across this country, each with its own story, strengths and needs. And this model is showing us what works and what is required to close the digital gap where it matters most. We will hear about the three-year findings from the research leads, Professor Lyndon Orman-Parker and Associate Professor Daniel Featherstone, as well as Dia Alferink, CEO of the Torres Strait Islander Media Association and one of the research partners in this project. Building on the Mapping the Digital Gap research, the advisory group recommending an expanded national data collection of First Nations people living in urban and regional Australia in 2023 to accurately measure progress on Target 17. This project was funded as part of the 2024 budget measures, with the ADII team starting this three-year project this year and releasing the first report for that project, and a new First Nations dashboard just 3 weeks ago. We'll hear a bit more about that from distinguished Professor Julian Thomas a bit later this morning. The other projects funded by the Australia Government includes community-wide Wi-Fi networks in 23 communities by NBN, with Minister Wells recently announcing a further 52 sites will receive Wi-Fi under a contestable model. There is also a digital mentors program and First Nations resource hub, with those projects to be announced in 2026. This builds on the expansion of mobile and Wi-Fi projects through the Mobile Black Spots program and Regional Connectivity program, and a range of other government and industry projects to support First Nations digital inclusion. I would also like to commend the engagement by the states and territories to address Closing the Gap Target 17 with a range of projects to co-invest with the Australian Government in mobile and Wi-Fi infrastructure, as well as supporting community facilities and local digital support workers, such as the Indigenous Knowledge Centres in Queensland and the Community Resources Centres in Western Australia, among a range of other projects. Industry have also been actively involved in projects to address Close the Gap Target 17, with Telstra and NBN particularly, providing a range of initiatives and leading a telecommunications working group focused on Target 17. It's my pleasure to invite Lauren Ganley from Telstra to open this morning's session to tell us about some of the great initiatives that Telstra are doing beyond the funding for ADII and the Mapping the Digital Gap research. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Naomi. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm on Larrakia country in Darwin and pay my respects to other Larrakia elders and ancestors that have kept country and culture strong. Before I get into my talk, I wanted to read out a note from Telstra CEO Vicky Brady, who would have loved to have been here, but she is unable to. So I'll just read a short note from Vicky. I'm sorry I can't be with you today. However, I wanted to include a few words at today's launch. I was proud to be at the launch of the Australian Digital Inclusion Index launch last month. The latest data tells us inclusion is improving, but major gaps remain. 1 in 5 Australians is still digitally excluded, with affordability, access, and ability continuing to hold people back, especially in remote communities and for First Nations people. Mapping the digital gap puts lived experiences at the centre of how we understand and respond to digital exclusion. In remote First Nations communities, daily internet use has lifted markedly since 2022 and non-use has fallen. That progress reflects community leadership, practical connectivity on the ground and targeted skills support. But the gap with the broader Australian population remains, and we have urgent work to do. Digital inclusion is essential to social, educational and health outcomes, and to national productivity. Telstra's new Stretch Reconciliation Action Plan commits us to concrete action over the next 3 years, more co-invested infrastructure in remote communities, lifting First Nations employment at Telstra, and deeper partnerships with First Nations businesses, all alongside programs focused on affordability and digital ability. Today is about partnership and place-based solutions, and I'm so pleased that Telstra is a part of this ongoing effort. Let's keep listening, co-designing and investing where need is greatest, so every community can participate fully in the digital world. Thank you. So that was Vicky's note at the launch. So yeah, I'll get into my my notes. So this project is personally really important to me, and it's important to Telstra, and we're proud to be a partner in this critical research. The Mapping the Digital Gap research builds on the Australian Digital Inclusion Index and our long-standing commitment to digital inclusion and First Nations initiatives. We know that connectivity is more than infrastructure. It's about enabling participation, opportunity, and cultural continuity. Partnerships between industry and research organisations are critical. They combine practical capability with deep evidence-based insights. And this collaboration ensures that solutions are informed by lived experience and grounded in rigorous data. Central to this work is First Nations digital leadership. Through the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group and expert panel that Naomi just spoke to, we are ensuring that decisions are shaped by those most impacted. This leadership is essential to addressing progress on closing the gap target 17, equal digital access for First Nations people. Mapping the digital gap has provided vital evidence to guide the advisory group and expert panel. One key recommendation has been the need for expanded national data collection to track progress on target 17. This research is not just about numbers, it's a form of truth-telling. The qualitative place-based approach goes beyond surveys. It captures on-the-ground realities, the challenges faced by residents and service providers in remote communities, and the innovative ways digital technologies are used to maintain language, cultural knowledge, and create locally relevant solutions. This research has already shaped Telstra's actions. For example, recent projects in case study sites include the mobile tower and backhaul upgrade at Gulawempu and the new mobile tower at Yullamoo. These investments respond directly to insights from the research and community priorities. Phase 2 of Mapping the Digital Gap builds on Phase 1 to deepen our understanding of the diversity of contexts and experiences across remote communities. This is about ensuring that future strategies are inclusive, responsive, and effective. Closing the digital gap is not just a technical challenge, it's a social imperative. It requires collaboration, evidence, and leadership from First Nations voices. So I invite all of us, industry, government, and community to lean in, share knowledge, and take action. Together, we can ensure that every community has the tools to thrive in a digital world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I just want to acknowledge your strong advocacy for digital inclusion, equity for our remote communities, and again, echoing your points there, that being centred around participation, opportunity, and cultural continuity. Thank you so much for being involved this morning. I'd now like to introduce Distinguished Professor Julian Thomas, who is the Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, and a Distinguished Professor in the School of Media and Communications at RMIT University. Julian has led the Australian Digital Inclusion Index research from its inception in 2015. Welcome, Julian.
Thank you, Naomi. Let me just say a little bit before we go further about the Digital Inclusion Index that underpins our research. Now, the index has become, over the decades since we started doing it, our principal national measure of digital inclusion and exclusion. The index has measured digital inclusion across three critical dimensions: access, affordability, and digital ability. And this allows us to understand the complexity of the challenges and how digital inclusion varies across Australia and across different social groups and over time. We collect our survey data for the index every 2 years. We recently launched the 2025 index report, as Vicky's message said. We're always looking to improve the index, and for our 2025 report, we've updated the way in which we measure affordability in particular to better reflect different household types and sizes, including, importantly, in remote communities, and the high number of mobile services that are being used within households. So this national data is important because it enables us to measure and monitor the digital inclusion of First Nations Australians against the wider population to accurately measure progress towards closing the gap target 17. Just to say a little bit very briefly about those three dimensions, because we'll be saying quite a bit more about them as we go. They're interconnected, of course, but they do get at different aspects of digital inclusion. Access tells us about whether people have sufficient internet connections and the devices they need. Affordability tells us about whether different households can manage the costs of a quality internet service and mobile service. And digital ability tells us about whether people have the skills and confidence to benefit from the digital services available over the internet. Now, the Mapping the Digital Gap project also collects data on First Nations use of media and information services to align with the indicators in Outcome 17, over and above those three dimensions. So we'll be talking about that as well. For those of you who did see the ADII report launch back in early November, one of the things we said there was that that was the first in a trilogy of reports to be launched by our team. The second in the trilogy was the Counting the Connectivity report that was released a week later. Now, Counting on Connectivity outlined research findings from the Measuring Digital Inclusion for First Nations Australians project, funded by the Australian government to accurately measure progress on closing the gap target 17. For that one, we did the first of 2 rounds of national surveys in 2025 in partnership with First Nations survey company Ipsos Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research Unit and social and local First Nations organisations in 10 target sites. That was combined with the ADII data and Mapping the Digital Gap data to provide a national evidence base to enable us to measure the gap between First Nations and non-First Nations Australians, and to do that across states, across zones of remoteness, and across different demographic groups. A new First Nations dashboard was also launched to make the data accessible for First Nations people, for organisations and communities in accordance with Priority Reform 4 and Indigenous data governance principles. The project is guided by the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group. So that gives us a national picture, the first accurate national picture of First Nations digital inclusion across urban, regional and remote Australia. It gives us an average total digital inclusion score of 63.4. This is a gap, a difference of 10.5 points against the score for non-First Nations Australians, which sits at 73.9. Now, digital inclusion scores, as you can see, vary between states and territories, with the lowest rates in the NT and Western Australia, where there's a large proportion of First Nations people living in remote and very remote communities and homelands. These remote areas are where most effort is going to be needed to make progress on Target 17. So this is where the Mapping the Digital Gap project comes in, the third part of our trilogy. This project was established to expand our data collection for First Nations Australians, particularly in remote and very remote Australia, where the barriers are greatest. It was developed with support of a First Nations expert advisory group. The project is a collaboration between RMIT and Swinburne researchers in the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, working with our industry partner, Telstra. A huge thank you to Telstra, and particularly to Lauren Ganley, who's just spoken, for her extraordinary and ongoing support and engagement with this project. So we've been working since 2022 on mapping the digital gap. The team has worked with local First Nations organisations and co-researchers in 12 remote communities. We've undertaken surveys, interviews, grounded research to understand how communication services and digital technologies are being used by First Nations residents and service providers, and to track changes in digital inclusion over 3 years. This gives us the critical data to measure progress on closing the gap target 17 in remote Australia, where the greatest effort is going to be required. So that brings us to our third report in this trilogy, the Mapping the Digital Gap 2025 Outcomes Report. And I would like to formally launch the Mapping the Digital Gap 2025 Outcomes Report today. This is the final report from phase 1 of our research, updating the 24 report, which explored changes in the research sites over the 3 years. The report provides 2025 index results for each of the 11 communities which we visited in 2024, along with progress on local digital inclusion plans in those communities. We analyse aggregate index scores for each dimension, each digital inclusion index dimension, and how those scores vary between sites and across different demographic groups. We provide case studies to highlight key findings, and we provide images and observations that highlight First Nations voices and experience. Before I wrap up, I'd like to acknowledge the extraordinary work of our amazing research teams at RMIT and Swinburne Universities in our centre, acknowledging Lyndon, Daniel, Sharon, Alison, Leah, Kieran, Yiman, Jenny and Yasmin, as well as other team members involved in the ADII, Anthony McCosker, Katie Morrison, Shane Borden, and of course Lauren from Telstra, and also Heather. Thanks also to our wonderful operations team here at the ADM+S Centre for their huge support, especially Miranda and Matt, who have helped organise today's launch event. With that, I'll hand back to you, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Julian. Again, a reminder that together these insights remind us that digital inclusion is about more than just getting online. It's about ensuring that our people have the access, affordability, the skills and culturally relevant information systems that they need. So I really appreciate you for that. To help gain a better understanding of the partnership model used in this research, we do have a short video to hear from some of the co-researchers in the communities involved in this work. So we'll cut to the video now. Thank you.
The world is moving online. Access to basic services like education, banking and healthcare now tends to require a device and a good connection. You really have to look at the communities and those that are getting left behind. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities living very remotely in Australia, you find that access to infrastructure, basic services and communication is often very limited. This is because of the small population sizes and the structural disadvantages they face. Overall coverage and internet reception can be very unreliable or non-existent. This creates a significant digital divide. It really is important that people in remote communities have access to the same quality of service as in the capital cities. Hi, I'm Professor Linda Norman Parker. I'm a Yayawa man from the Barkly Tablelands region of the Northern Territory. I'm Principal Research Fellow on the Mapping the Digital Gap project. I'm also co-chair of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group. We established the Mapping the Digital Gap program in 2021, supported by Telstra. We wanted to really understand the digital divide between First Nations people living in remote and very remote communities compared to other Australians in the rest of the country. Over the last 3 years, we've visited 12 First Nations communities in remote areas to see how they access the internet, use their mobile devices, how they get online, and their digital ability to get online safely. Getting out into community is the best way to understand the obstacles for digital inclusion in remote communities. We also learn and see how people are actually using the infrastructure, whether the infrastructure is working or not, and what are some of the requirements that communities need to move forward to get better connection. With our community partners, we actually fund them to support our research. So that means that they have an opportunity not only to engage in the research and the outcomes reports, but they also have an income stream from undertaking this research with us. And it's really important when we partner with community organisations that they have some sense of ownership over the research. And we also feed back to the community all of the results so they can actually look at their own individual community and what their individual needs are. And they can use the community outcomes reports as an advocacy tool for their services locally.
Basically, the partnership and the research part of it has been awesome. It's basically highlighted a lot of areas that majority of us wouldn't think of on a day-to-day basis. It also highlights the remoteness of Columbro and what is needed for these parts of the world, and what can be done, what needs to be improved, and and what still is a possibility.
The reports from the Mapping the Digital Gap were really good for us to use as an advocacy tool for improving services here in Wodjil. They were really good to use for an advocacy tool for the regional connectivity grant. They were one of the main resources we relied on for the increase of the speeds and the requirements for improvements in digital connectivity in Wodjil. That's something we refer to quite often.
Because the community reports are widely distributed online for free, we also provide those reports to Telstra, our funding partner. Telstra is then able to utilise the research and reports and look at them in a way that supports them and Lauren Ganley, the Telstra advocate, to really advocate for services required in those communities that we've done our research in. Gallowinku was one of our research partners for the last 3 years. From those reports, we found that the Telstra tower and Telstra services were very congested under 4G. That provided the data for Telstra to go back and look at replacing that 4G tower with a 5G tower.
The Mapping the Digital Gap research has been instrumental in providing the data on remote communities, and the gap that exists with digital inclusion gives us the evidence to help us work out where we're going to invest to help close that digital gap.
Over the next 3 years, we'll continue the Mapping the Digital Gap project in another 8 remote communities. A part of this research will really be able to monitor the outcomes of those federal budget initiatives and provide extra data on how communities are progressing towards closing that digital divide. Through the Mapping the Digital Gap project, we've seen that it's really important to ensure that industry gets on board, governments get on board, and communities are on board, and that all of these initiatives to close that digital divide are run and led by the communities themselves.
Thank you again to everyone who has joined us online this morning. We will now hear directly from Diat Alfarink, CEO of the Torres Strait Islander Media Association, one of the partner organisations involved in the research. It's my great pleasure to welcome Diat this morning. Thank you.
Couple Migi Bothanga, everybody. I'm here in Thursday Island, lovely Torres Strait, Kauri country, and acknowledge all my fellow First Nations families there tuning in. Yes, the project has been amazing for the Torres Strait and our community. And I just want to thank everyone that's been involved in supporting us be a partner, and it is really important that we are a partner in this and the co-design of it. It's been really important having Lala Gutchin and Nixon Mai part of it from Arab was really so important to the way that the research was done. So I can't praise that enough. And the benefits, of course, have been about now getting more digital ability in our community. I think things like laptops come into our community now where community can start getting more digital skills has been a direct result of that. Obviously, we run a radio station as well, and so getting people involved in communications and awareness about connectivity is so important, and ability to function in this remote part of the world. Beautiful part, but also restricted, of course, sometimes. I mean, we're on the sea a lot of the time, and that connectivity issue is so important to travel. Families going from island to island, things about language and culture, how we record, how we access our communities, our elders are so important. And I think the work that has been going on here in the Torres Strait as one of the 12 communities as part of the last 3 years, we've really appreciated that support, and we look forward to continuing to be part of it. I don't know what else to say. It's been great, and I look forward to, continuing to be part of these conversations. And yeah, there you go. I don't want to talk too much.
That is so deadly. And again, want to acknowledge your very personal experiences with connectivity, which is why you're in the deadly music room this morning up there. So big shout out to all you mob up there on the islands. And again, we appreciate your leadership and work, Diet. Very big SL from all of us for sharing your experiences this morning. To speak more about the research, I'd like to invite First Nations Principal Research Fellow with the Mapping the Digital Gap project, Professor Lyndon Orman-Parker, who we've just heard from in that video. He is the co-chair of the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group and Australian Research Council Research Fellow with the Centre for Heritage and Museum Studies at the Australian National University. Thank you, Lyndon.
Thanks very much, Naomi, and I'd like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people whose traditional country I'm on here today in Canberra. As mentioned, the research was conducted in 12 First Nations remote communities across Australia, and they were selected based on a diverse geography, size, remoteness, and communication services. This provided a rich understanding of how digital inclusion is impacted by the social, cultural, and economic context and range of services and support available in each community. The project followed the Australian Institute for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies Code of Ethics for Indigenous Research. As mentioned earlier, we were also guided by a First Nations expert advisory group, which included Lauren Ganley, Dr. Scott Winch, Dr. Heron Loban, and we thank them for their advice. We also heard from DIAT about the partnership and how important local community partnerships are. Our partners like CIMA and the local co-researchers Lala and Nixon on Erebor Island was key to building community trust and engagement. So thank you to all our research partners and those that were surveyed and participated in the research. Between 2022 and 2024, we conducted 32 research trips and worked with 44 co-researchers. We completed 2,063 surveys and conducted 350 interviews. We provided the research findings back to each community as individual community outcomes report, as I'd mentioned earlier in the video. We have completed 27 outcome reports to date. All of these are currently available online on the Mapping the Digital Gap website. The reports also include a proposed local digital inclusion plan. So I encourage people to have a look at those digital inclusion plans, especially for your own communities and the types of strategies that you can put in place to help identify barriers to digital inclusion and strategies for improving inclusion. This includes suggestions for potential partners to improve connectivity and options for improving digital skills of community members. These place-based plans help to provide a community benefit from the research by setting out a pathway towards improving digital inclusion and guiding external investment and support. In our 2025 outcomes report launched today, we have updated the community profiles with the Australian Digital Inclusion Index results for the 11 communities we visited last year. These profiles outline the size, remoteness, and communication services available, along with key results. We have also provided a summary of progress on the local digital inclusion plans. For instance, in Gallowinku community in Northeast Arnhem Land, they had been advocating for improved mobile and broadband services for a number of years. Over our 3-year period, significant improvements were made. For example, the East Arnhem Fibre network was upgraded. The mobile service at Gallowinku was upgraded to 5G, and a community Wi-Fi network was installed by NBN, providing free community access to all residents. We also found that many agencies had moved to Starlink satellite services over the course of the last 3 years. While not all communities have had this level of upgrade, the Digital Inclusion Plan provides a way of tracking progress and identifying and understanding needs. As Julian outlined, for this year's report, we have been able to compare ADII scores for our research communities against the national First Nations and non-First Nations results. I will briefly describe some of these findings. The digital gap between First Nations and non-First Nations Australian increases significantly with remoteness from 6.2 in major cities to 16.5 in remote Australia and 2.8 in very remote Australia, more than double the average of 10.5. This chart shows that affordability is the biggest contributor to the digital gap in urban and regional and remote areas, but in very remote communities, access is the biggest contributor to this digital divide. The map on the right clearly shows the impact of remoteness on digital inclusion, with large parts of NT, Western Australia, South Australia, having scores of 50 or less, meaning that many people living in these areas are highly digitally excluded. Our First Nations dashboard enables users to click on a particular state and view scores according to their remoteness categories. Daniel will demonstrate this shortly. The ADII defines a score of 61 or below as digitally excluded, and below 50 is highly digitally excluded. Nationally, First Nations Australia face digital exclusion at twice the rate of other Australians. However, this rate is even higher in mapping the digital gap sites, where digital exclusion impacts 73% or 3 in 4 people. Close to half are considered highly excluded, meaning they face significant barriers to accessing and using digital services and technologies. This is why we need to focus digital inclusion efforts on those living in very remote communities. While the average index score for First Nations Australians in very remote is 51.1, however, across the 11 mapping the digital sites visited, the score was 49.6. The access dimensions of digital inclusion is the biggest contributor, as I mentioned before. This is why targeted First Nations programs aimed at expanding mobile services and Wi-Fi access in remote communities would significantly help reduce the access barriers. However, the access measure refers to uptake of home broadband and mobile services as well as the use of online services and devices and data use. While availability of services needs to be addressed, socioeconomic factors also impact on access. The chart on the right shows that index scores vary widely across all 11 research sites, with 56 in Ereb down to 34 in Wadden. As the 3 dimensions of digital inclusion are interrelated, we need to have programs to address all 3 elements to make progress on Target 17. And this is something that everyone viewing this is well aware of. Despite the big gap in access, our survey findings have shown improvements from 2022 to 2024. This includes a 12% increase in those with internet access and a 6% increase in people using the internet, now up to 86%. We also saw an increase in the number of people using the internet daily, up by 19% to 62% in 2024. These findings are largely a result of improved services, such as the small cell mobile service in Jarrajin, installed in 2022, and the new 4G tower at Yullamu in 2023, where there was previously no coverage. The introduction of Wi-Fi hotspots in Ereb and Wujal and community-wide Wi-Fi mesh networks in Columbaroo, Warrakurna and Pipla have contributed to a 31% increase in people accessing the internet via public Wi-Fi. With new Wi-Fi networks rolled out since 2024 in Galawinku, Gangam, Wujal, and the other 52, there are now, and the other 52 First Nations communities will be provided with Wi-Fi networks that was announced by the Minister last week. We expect to see continued improvements in access for our First Nations communities over the next 3 years. So thank you very much, and back to you, Naomi.
Thank you so much, Lyndon, for speaking to the incredible amount of work the collective dedication that has gone into this work, but also a reminder that strong partnerships are essential to digital inclusion because no single organisation can close the gap alone. It certainly takes shared commitment, resources and relationships to ensure every community can fully participate in a digital world. We'll now hear from Project Co-Lead, Associate Professor Daniel Featherstone. Daniel is a Principal Research Fellow at RMIT and part of the ADM+S Centre. He is a member of the expert panel that supports the First Nations Digital Inclusion Advisory Group and sits on the board of ACAN, the Communications Consumer Peak Body, and several other advisory groups. And Daniel previously managed the national peak body First Nations Media Australia before moving into research at RMIT. It's my great pleasure to welcome Daniel. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Naomi, and thanks, Julian and Lyndon, for that great overview. Before I start, I'd like to just add my SO to DIAD and the team at CIMA and all of our community partners and co-researchers who've been critical to this work. We couldn't have done this without you. A huge thanks to Lauren for joining us today and for your leadership and helping us to do this work over the last few years, and ongoing support to develop solutions to address the issues we're finding. I'd like to add my thanks to the amazing team that Julian outlined earlier, our fantastic team here at the ADM+S Centre, and especially to everyone who's participated in getting this report together. Sharon, Yeman, Kieran, Lyndon, Yasmin, Shane, Alison, and Leah, who's done just a fantastic job with the design and helping to pull together the video and website. And thanks to the broader ADM+S team for all of the support. I'll now share some of the additional findings beyond what Lyndon's talked about from our research, but do encourage you to go into our report and look through. There's a lot of information in there. So as Lyndon outlined, the average access score is 34.8, which is a 42.4 gap below the national non-First Nations average. That score has gone up very slightly, 0.9, since we first started in 2022. However, over that same period, non-First Nations scores have gone up by 5.1, so that gap is actually widening. So given all of the improved mobile and Wi-Fi services that we know about, why is that score so low? And it's because the access score is not a measure of the availability of services, but how each person actually connects and uses them. It includes both mobile and household connections, speed and data allowance, devices used, and the frequency of use. So in 2024, we found that only 7% of households had fixed broadband, and that compares with 90% for non-First Nations Australians. A key factor is the low uptake of fixed household internet is that most of these services are postpaid, which makes it difficult for low-income households to maintain. And that results in 55% of our respondents being mobile-only internet users. And that means that's the only way that they're connecting. That compares with 10% for other non-First Nations Australians. Mobile phone ownership has increased slightly to 74%, with almost all using prepaid, well below 94% for other Australians. And 86% of people now use the internet, but only 15% are using a computer at home. So that gives you some idea of the differences in the way people are accessing and using these services and the reasons for that score being so low. Looking at affordability, the score for affordability is 59.6. That's 11 points below the national average, but 2.3 less than the national First Nations score of 13.3. And that's because we look at affordability based on household size and a sort of a relative household income to a bundle of internet and mobile services. It's not the actual expenditure. Cost of devices is also a challenge with high turnover and transfer of devices within families. So the lack of devices means more sharing of devices, which has implications for access and safety. With increased online activity, household expenditure on data has gone up significantly, in fact by $88 per month for individual households, up to $291 per month, and for large households up to $407 per month, and that's a $181 increase. So nearly 2/3 of people are sacrificing or cutting back on essential costs such as food or bills to afford internet. It's hoped that these community Wi-Fi networks and community prepaid mobile plan will help in reducing those affordability challenges over the coming years. With digital ability, the biggest improvement has been in digital ability. So that's an 8.7 improvement in the score since 2023, and that's mapping quite well to the improvements for non-First Nations. So that is tracking well, but there's still a 19% gap, a 19-point gap. And that's particularly large for people with disability, those who are elders, those who speak a language other than English at home, and those who did not complete secondary school. Over 3 years, there was a 19% increase in daily internet use and a similar increase in engagement in online activities and online services and content and other applications relevant to people's lives and their communities. And that's despite those significant barriers around access and affordability. With limited training and support options in communities, the primary way that people are learning is through family support and or reliance on stretched service providers for assistance. So there is an urgency for those digital mentors programs and other digital support programs in communities to ensure that we're not leaving people further behind. Looking at media and information, since 2022, we saw a shift from the use of traditional broadcast media towards online streaming, with 66% of people using YouTube daily to access TV and media content. That's more than double in 2022 and 40% above commercial TV. 70% access daily news and information through direct and face-to-face communications. That's followed by Facebook and commercial TV. So I'll drill into that a bit more shortly when we look at the dashboard. But a key contributor to this shift to online has been the lack of TV services available in communities via VAST or the satellite connectivity. And we've seen that 61% of households are unable to access free-to-air TV via VAST, and that's up from 50% in 2022. There's a real need to get back to local TV broadcasting. A lot of communities are calling for that, and to maintain that vast equipment to ensure that free-to-air TV services are available, because that's adding to the costs for households using data to access that content. We also saw reduced access to radio services, and part of that is due to maintenance issues and need for ongoing funding and support for the remote media organisations to provide those services and ensure that there's trusted news, information and language content available. I'm now going to jump in and show you very quickly our dashboard. This is, we're very proud of the dashboard, and it's a fantastic tool to be able to show all of the data that we've collected over this last 3 years, so this is on the Australian Digital Inclusion Index website. We now have a dedicated First Nations dashboard. The front page enables you to see the big picture of how the scores compare nationally. And as Lyndon mentioned, we can now go in to each state and look at those scores by state, by remoteness. And a new functionality we've just added is to be able to look at Indigenous regions. So you can actually look at the region where you live and see how that compares nationally as well. The dashboard has separate pages for access, affordability and digital ability, and you can see all of the different tiles there. You can go and scroll and explore those according to different geographic groups or demographic groups. Down the bottom, there is a filter to be able to provide much more detailed view of those. For instance, you can look at just 18 to 34-year-olds or elders. We have all of our remote communities listed, so you can go and see the data for remote communities that we've visited, again, according to those different dimensions of access, affordability and digital ability. But I'm aware I'm out of time and we do want some time for question and answers. So I'm going to hand back to you, Naomi, so that we can give everyone a chance to ask their questions. Naomi's muted.
Sorry, I was just talking to myself there, you mob, for a little while. Forgot to unmute myself. Thank you again, Daniel, and for the activation of the dashboard as an important tool in understanding the incredible amount of work that has been involved in this. Also a reminder that our communities do deserve to move with the world and not being left behind, watching from the sidelines. That digital connectivity must be a bridge, not another barrier. We can't build a digital future that leaves our First Nations communities further behind than when we started. We will throw to a Q&A session to wrap up today's gathering. There is an opportunity for participants to pop some questions into the chat, but I thought I might start off with a few questions, and I might start with Lyndon, if that's okay with you, Lyndon. I'm just wondering if he's still online. Of the projects being undertaken in the communities you visited, Lyndon, which do you think are having the most impact on digital inclusion?
Sorry, Naomi, could you just repeat that question?
Yeah, sure. Of the projects being undertaken in the communities you visited, which do you think are having the most impact on digital inclusion?
That's hard to say. But the free community Wi-Fi, I think, is one of the biggest impacts, because people are able to get online. For instance, when NBN and through their service provider do build the free community Wi-Fis, they also have a digital champion and a digital mentor in the community to help people get online and get online safely. So I think that's probably the highest impact.
Fantastic, thank you. Might throw to Daniel and just get some further, I guess, insights on those community-led decisions and, sorry, community-led solutions.
Yeah, thanks for that, Naomi. And what we've done with this year's report is in each of those community research sites, we've shown the fantastic work that each community has done in telling us about what those different strategies are that they want to implement to address their own digital inclusion plan, and then who's involved and how to progress against those. So we've seen just fantastic work. I'll just point to Wadair. We're really concerned about the low level of digital ability. They've just opened the T-Hub, a digital hub to be able to have people access computers and have digital support. So a digital mentor available to support community members to access all those online services and develop their skills. And it's in a locally run friendly space. So they're just some of the ways that communities are looking at how to do their own solutions. There's lots of examples of that across the report if you go through all of those research sites.
Thank you so much, and I will acknowledge decisions as well, right? Because community-led decisions are centred around community-led decision makings too. So thank you for that. Hi, Julian. I'm going to come back to you. I'm going to ask you, how does this project fit into the broader research agenda of ADM+S?
So one of the big challenges that we're most interested in across the centre is how do we make sure that the kinds of rapid digital transformations that we're seeing occur across so many areas of life, how can we make sure that they're managed in ways which are inclusive, responsible, and ethical? And we see the work that we're doing here in terms of providing an evidence base for positive action to make sure that our First Nations communities can participate in the digital economy on equal terms, that these digital services, which are becoming more and more critical across so many areas of life, from education to work to health, information, media services, right across the board, just to make sure that they are inclusive. So as a centre, we're really proud to be working with our incredible partners on this project, helping to drive some positive change in this space.
Fantastic. Thank you. Lauren, I again want to acknowledge your deep commitment to supporting this work in your role. How does the results of this research support the work of Telstra and other telcos?
Thanks, Naomi. It's, the evidence that we need of lived experiences, so experiences of people who are missing out, but also the research gives us an idea of what opportunities are available if there was good, reliable, adequate connectivity. And in terms of other telcos, so Sam DeMarco from NBN and myself are co-chairing the First Nations Telco Working Group, which is a subgroup of the FINDIAG. And what's been great is we've got reference points to go to talk about how we all going to collaborate together for greater impact. So it's been invaluable. Thanks, Naomi.
Thanks, Lauren. I'll come back to my deadly titter Diet as well. You're one of our trailblazers, Sis, of Indigenous media, and you currently serve as the co-chair of FNMA. What does First Nations media, what is the role that they play in closing the digital gap?
Oh, well, it's keeping up with the times, isn't it? We have to be accessible to our own mob, and we have to also, as we said, the broadcasting is changing and we have to go to our audience, but we also have to have our community participating. So we're really that connectivity here in the communities is really important, so that people can contribute with content. We can do more language awareness around the connectivity issue, which is something we're looking forward to working with soon with, I think NBN are wanting to do some ad campaigns in language about connectivity and the issues and awareness, and also the digital skills, which I mentioned before. So it's really important from a First Nations media, remote media organisation that we are leading by example. So, getting at all of we've got Starlink or we got NBN, we've got to have both, it's all of it really. But we still radio as well, which is always live and always exciting for mob, but we have to get onto those platforms, and the connectivity issue is vital to our work.
Awesome, thank you. Always live and always deadly in our communities. Look, as we close, I think that's the time that we have for questions, but I certainly want to acknowledge the significance of what today's launch represents. The Mapping the Digital Gap 2025 Outcomes Report marks the culmination of years of deep listening, research and partnership across those remote First Nations communities, offering grounded insights into access, affordability, digital ability and the media and information, along with community-led case studies that show real progress on local digital inclusion plans. This project, established through the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society, in partnership with Telstra, remains the first and most comprehensive study of remote First Nations participation in the digital economy. And I'm sure we'd all agree that its contributions are absolutely critical as the nation works towards closing the gap of Target 17 by 2026. Today has brought together many voices from government, industry, research, community organisations and our First Nations partners to walk through the updated findings, policy recommendations and next steps, and to preview the new First Nations dashboard that places remote communities and Indigenous regions clearly on that map. So again, thank you all for joining us, for your ongoing commitment to digital equity, and certainly for walking alongside our communities as we work together collectively toward a more connected and inclusive future. It's been great, and thank you again for having me as your MC today.